Okay, I think we can open this session then. So it's my pleasure to present today's speaker to you, Jan Halák, from the Palacký University of Olomouc, where Jan is assistant professor. Jan Halák is an expert on Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology, was published many very interesting and rich papers on Merleau-Ponty that I've certainly learned a lot from. I'll just mention two of your recent papers. Embodied Higher Cognition, Insights from Merleau-Ponty's Interpretation of Motor Intentionality, published in Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences in 2023. And Mathematics, Embodied, Merleau-Ponty and Geometry and Algebra as Fields of Motor in Action, published in Synthese in 2022. And today, the title of Jan Halák's talk is Merleau-Ponty, Michotte, and the Gestalt of Life. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric, and hello everyone. Thanks for inviting me here. Very happy to be here. I've been here once before at a conference, and I really enjoyed it. And we had some great conversations. We are now finalizing the output of that conference, a book with Ricardo Mendoza. So I'm looking forward to that. Today, thank you for being here. I will again speak about Merleau-Ponty, who is my main interest in my research. And because I know that Eric also works on the cross-section between Merleau-Ponty and Gestalt psychology or Gestalt theory, I have decided to kind of sneak in the notion of Gestalt into my talk, and I will be talking about Gestalt a lot. And I will try to also make a bridge between ideas from Merleau-Ponty and Gestalt, or thinking about wholes, totalities. I'll just say a few words before I get to the talk itself. Where does this talk and this project come from? I'm currently working on a larger text, a book, which is focused on the ontology of organism. This is mostly based on Merleau-Ponty. At least half of the book is about Merleau-Ponty, but the second half is also about some ideas from philosophy of biology. So, in particular, the works by or connected with the idea of autopoiesis by Maturana and Varela, and some of the organizational approaches in theoretical biology today. So this bigger project leads me to think about natural wholes. What does it mean to have something as a whole in the nature? And so this is the broader topic, and here I will be thinking about slightly more particular topic, and that's the organism. So the organism for me, as this is one of the most prominent, of course, wholes that we find in nature, and it's been a mystery for philosophy, as you probably know yourself, how to think about the whole without destroying it, but without making it too much independent from the other stuff in nature either. So this is the context, the topic. Okay, let me start. As probably anyone who heard about Merleau-Ponty knows, he was a holistic thinker. So he thought about wholes in general, but in particular, he thought about living bodies and organisms as wholes. So as such, he aligns with not only Gestalt theory, but also with organicist traditions in philosophy of life and nature, such as Goldstein, of course, who influenced him very much in his first book, Structured Behavior, but also thinkers like Emma Bergson, Hans Jonas, Georges Canguilhem, and more recently Maturana and Varela, Ezequiel Di Paulo, and a field of research called organizational approaches in theoretical biology, represented by authors such as Álvaro Moreno, Matteo Mosio, Mario Monteville, or Leonardo Bisci. So my aim today is, however, to complicate this holism in several ways. First, I will show that as Merleau-Ponty matures and his thinking matures, he integrates a series of unique insights into how organic wholes are open to concrete spatial-temporal events they encounter during their development. Because of this openness, organic wholes are never totalities in a strict sense, but rather fields of sense that undergo reorganizations. They always remain on the way of becoming totalities without ever actually achieving it. In other words, the totality of the organism is always deferred structurally and temporally. So in the first part of my talk, I'll outline this interpretation by focusing on Merleau-Ponty's engagement with embryology from the mid-1950s, primarily in his lectures on nature and other related manuscripts. In the second part, I will then draw out the implications of this conception of the organic whole as an open unity for its relation to the observer. I will analyze Merleau-Ponty's more phenomenological analysis or interpretations of the conditions under which these dynamical organic gestalts appear to someone. In this context, I will draw on Merleau-Ponty's interpretations of experimental gestalt psychologist Albert Michotte and his highly original book, The Perception of Causality, from 1946. So my overall goal is to demonstrate that with this unique interpretation of organic totality as a dynamic gestalt, Merleau-Ponty positions himself beyond the opposition between naturalism and transcendentalism, and he offers a highly original framework for understanding organisms as self-producing wholes. But at the same time, he resists framing this either as a naturalization of the organic whole, as in the theory of autopoiesis, for example, or settling for a Kantian transcendentalist solution, sometimes called teleonomic. So instead, he outlines how the perception of an organic whole as a whole builds on a fundamental ontological link between the observer and the observed, a link he also calls intercorporeity or interanimality. The inquiry into the ontological status of organic wholes thus leads him to an entirely new ontology of nature, one we might call relational, and in which all living beings are not merely epistemologically, but also ontologically linked through how their bodies are structured and how they interact. So now for the first part of the talk. In the second year of his lectures on nature from 1957 and 1958, Merleau-Ponty revisits the problem of organic wholes by drawing on empirical studies of embryonic development. He interprets in particular George Coghill's research on the development of the axolotl, a small amphibian resembling a lizard, and Arnold Gesell's work on human embryogenesis. He will continue this investigation in the third year of the lectures, 1959 and 1960, through a study of Hans Driesch's and Spemann's experimental embryology. Ponty's sustained attention to embryology allows him to demonstrate a point that his earlier work left unexplored. The organic whole is not merely a holistic unity opposed to its parts, as in the structure of behavior, but a whole that is structurally open to influences of local material conditions from below, and open to a future that has not yet arrived. In Coghill's work, Merleau-Ponty finds a vivid illustration of this openness. The axolotl undergoes radical anatomical and behavioral transformations during its development. From immobility through partial mobility and swimming to terrestrial locomotion. So it starts walking on land as it matures. Coghill's research reveals that what Merleau-Ponty calls a double movement. On the one hand, anatomical maturation and behavior appears pre-adapted to environmental needs. The axolotl develops the axolotl development leads from one well-adapted behavior, swimming, to another, quite differently organized, walking. This confirms that the organism is a whole, as its parts serve its overall pattern and at all stages. On the other hand, however, the axolotl's development also depends on local physical-chemical properties of its body. Merleau-Ponty draws particular attention to Coghill's description of so-called pre-neural gradients, corresponding to a system of differences in sensitivity to chemical, physical, and electrical stimuli in different tissues that serve as material precursors to the nervous system. He highlights these gradients because they enable rudimentary responses even before nervous connections are established, and therefore attest that the organism's behavior evolves from properties situated below the level of its current structural constitution. The axolotl is therefore a gestalt, or a totality, by a perpetually nascent one that grows out of substructural material conditions rather than being imposed by a pre-existing organizational principle. In the structural behavior, Merleau-Ponty defended the irreducibility of the whole against analytical decomposition into parts, but he didn't truly investigate how the whole is in turn shaped by local conditions from below. Coghill's research addresses precisely this question. It shows that the holistic organization of the organism is always in the process of growing out of local material conditions, gradients, tissue sensitivities, physical-chemical thresholds that are themselves changing, of course. The organism is not assembled from independently existing parts. It becomes more internally differentiated over the course of its development, so it becomes more machine-like as it differentiates. But this also means that its holistic organization is never a completed reality. The whole is perpetually nascent, perpetually still in the process of emerging from below. After interpreting Cockhill, Merleau-Ponty turns to Gestalt, whose research on human embryogenesis helps him clarify a crucial point. According to Merleau-Ponty, Gestalt's work demonstrates above all the organic whole does not exist as an independent principle. While Cockhill's emphasis on the organism as an integrated whole from the beginning of its life could still create the impression of vitalism or finalism, Gestalt's research shows why ontogenesis is not the, quote, unfurling of a principle that descends into matter, end of quote. The organism is not the manifestation of a supraorganic event, but rather the seed of endogenous animation, a auto-regulatory fluctuation that maintains itself simultaneously in a state of equilibrium and in a state of disequilibrium. These are all formulations by Merleau-Ponty from the second year of Nature lectures. Gestalt's central insight, as Merleau-Ponty reads it, concerns the deep inseparability of anatomy and behavior. A living body is inseparable from postures, attitudes, and a range of gestures, all of which can be considered modes of motor action, according to Gestalt. Postural function is sustained by muscular tone, the basic activity of the organism, which is closely connected to basal metabolism. Between posture and action, there is no precise boundary for Gestalt. The body is open to the outside through posture and the behaviors it mediates, while posture in turn is closely bound to the body and finds its support in it. Body and behavior thus have a reciprocal character, as Merleau-Ponty puts it. Gestalt's work confirms, as Merleau-Ponty concludes, that the organism should be understood as a field, as both physical being and a meaning, tout à la fois physique et sens. Or, as he puts it in his summary of the second year of the Nature lectures, there is a, quote, certain activity of the animal which is nothing but an extension of its being, end of quote. With Cockhill and Gestalt, Merleau-Ponty also discovers the temporal dimension of this structural openness. Understanding any given developmental stage requires considering anatomy and behavior as mutual anticipations and reminiscences. During the tadpole stage of the axolotl development, nerve fibers develop in areas where they currently have no functional justification, but where they will have once the limbs form. Here, the anatomical apparatus, Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, has meaning only for a future, and the embryo is matter which refers to the future, end of quote. Conversely, when the tadpole's muscles are stimulated, it performs movements resembling swimming, a behavior it has not yet mastered. In Merleau-Ponty's formulation, behavior is not a bundle of functions, it anticipates functioning, contains within itself a reference to the future. The organism at each moment of its development, quote, lacks what it will follow and contains an emptiness of what will be filled later. Each moment of its present leans on the future. Again, Merleau-Ponty's formulations. The embryological findings show that the organism is indeed a gestalt, a holistic whole, but one that permanently exists as an outline, ébauche, esquisse, of a future whole. It is a whole that is underdetermined, open to future specifications that have not yet occurred. Merleau-Ponty captures this by saying that outlining is the proper mode of existence of life. Life is a being of outline or sketch. Être d'esquisse ou d'ébauche. In short, the organism is not simply a holistic unity imposing order on its materials from above. It is a whole that is structurally open to its local material conditions, as demonstrated by HPhil, open to reciprocal dynamics, to anatomy and behavior, as demonstrated by Gestalt, and on a general level, open to future that has not yet arrived. The embryological findings described above show that each developmental stage of the organism is incomplete relative to its future. However, this incompleteness is not mere deficiency. It has, as Merleau-Ponty insists, a positive value for the organism. It provides an open-ended orientation, a criterion of relevance that is itself subject to revisions. This is where Merleau-Ponty's conception of the organism diverges from conceptions in which the whole provides a universalistic top-down criterion for meaning to the organism. In holistic conceptions where the whole is treated as a self-maintaining system, the criterion for meaning is ultimately given by the need for self-maintenance. Everything in the organism is for the sake of the whole's continued existence. For Merleau-Ponty, by contrast, what gives direction to the organism is not the whole in this top-down fashion. The criterion for meaning in the organism is beyond the requirement for maintenance of its unity, informed by the organism's specific lack of unity, the imbalances of its conditions, which represent the sort of existential question that requires an answer from the future. As he writes, quote, the organism traces out what its future will be. It contains a project in reference to the whole of its life, but the concrete realization of this project is not foreseen by nature. End of quote. To be sure, these considerations do not lead Merleau-Ponty to deny the self-organizing dimensions of the organism. In a text contemporary to the Nature Lectures, The Adventures of Dialectics, he explicitly acknowledges this dimension when he writes that, quote, at the level of the organism, no matter how they may finally be grounded, meanings are operating before they are known. End of quote. Similarly, at the beginning of the Nature Lectures, he mentions that we should understand nature as an autoproduction of sense. So in this respect, Merleau-Ponty shares common ground with the organic tradition mentioned at the outset. As we have already begun to see, however, Merleau-Ponty insists equally on the open and complete character of this self-organization. He cautions against positioning a perfection in the midst of becoming, as he puts it, and interpreting the whole as a positive principle with an autonomous existence beyond the facts. I quote again Merleau-Ponty from the second year of lectures, to read in the axolotl's first movement the act of swimming, so when it's still a tadpole and it reacts to some primitive stimulation, and to project what is yet to come into the past amounts to a retrospective illusion. So we shouldn't interpret this primitive movement as some kind of telos that is already present in the rudimentary organism. This critique targets vitalism in Merleau-Ponty himself, which, according to him, introduces life as a special cause on top of physical-chemical causes, as he puts it in the structure of behavior. But I believe that this observation applies equally to any naturalistic attempt to posit the whole as a self-maintaining, operationally closed system. As Merleau-Ponty argues through his interpretation of Driesch, the global form of the organism is shaped not by a positive factor, but by a set of losses of equilibrium, releasing a set of causalities that regulate. That's a quote from the third year of the Nature Lectures. The organism is a fluctuation track, piège à fluctuation. Its wholeness arises from a dynamic interplay of limitations and possibilities within hollows or singular points in physical space, rather than being imposed by a meta-spatial force, like for Driesch. Its teleology, properly understood, is not controlled by a positive principle. It is nothing but a pattern of negations, a complicated system of negations. This is a quote of Driesch by Merleau-Ponty in the third year of lectures. Since the global form of the organism never perfectly aligns with how the organism is materially constituted at a specific moment, the positive determination of its perceived entelechy is always set further back, and its totality is inherently emergent. Merleau-Ponty captures this in a striking formulation. Instead of strictly delimiting the boundaries of the system, the whole pervades the current state of the organism merely as an operant non-being, un non-être opérant. This operant non-being is, as he puts it, efficacious in the organism's negotiation of its equilibrium with the environment. The whole is a preliminary system of references set to undergo reorganizations and specifications indefinitely as the animal encounters new spatial-temporal unique events. This is something he calls institution with reference to Husserl's idea of Stiftung. So this openness to new events that reorganize this field of sense the organism is, he calls it Stiftung. As Don Baith, a commentator of Merleau-Ponty, has argued, Merleau-Ponty's philosophy of the organic whole integrates what could be called its ontological incompleteness. So, despite profound similarities, Merleau-Ponty's approach thus diverges from autopoietic tradition in two respects. First, the organism never seems, in fact, to achieve what has been called the operational closure or organizational closure. What changes in development are not merely materials or what Maturana and Varela calls structure as well, underlying a stable organization, but the organization itself, since it cannot be strictly separated from the local spatial-temporal conditions. And second, and more fundamentally, the whole is for Merleau-Ponty not an ontological real entity, where the naturalist tradition treats organization as a constitutive property of the organism itself, such as in Thompson or in some commentators of the organizational tradition, Merleau-Ponty characterizes it as an operant non-being, efficacious in the organism's development, but never a fully realized entity. This distinction is what opens, as I will argue below, the question of empathy. It is worth noting, however, that recent organizational approaches in biology have moved closer, it seems, to Merleau-Ponty's position in at least one respect. Their concept of organizational regimes, for example, treats organization not as an invariant, as in the poetic tradition, but as something realized through continually shifting configurations. So here I refer to contemporary authors, Monteville or Mostre. Merleau-Ponty's reaction to Raymond Rouillard and his concept of neo-finalism in his lectures on institution and passivity underscores this point just made. Merleau-Ponty agrees with Rouyer that organic form is a gestalt, that it must therefore be described in a language of signification. However, he directly rejects Rouyer's idea that there's a form in itself, that the organism is a form in itself, form en soi. For Rouyer, organic forms are absolute domains of overview. It's termed by Rouyer, which means that each part of the organism directly knows all other parts through the internal unity of the form. Against this, Merleau-Ponty insists that organic totalities are exactly as perception offers them, imperfect and incomplete, or more perfect totalities, dystelic or hypertelic. And Merleau-Ponty says, this is exactly what we see, Gestalten. They are imperfect or too much perfect compared to some invariant. So the biological terms dystely refers to organic forms that fall short of adaptation, so maladaptive or deficient patterns. And in contrast, hypertely refers to the opposite, the forms that are excessively elaborate, exceeding any apparent functional need. If organic form were truly a form in itself, with complete self-transparency, Merleau-Ponty believes such imperfections and excesses would be inexplicable. So Merleau-Ponty's point is that concrete organic forms, as they are perceptually given, are always more or less perfect instantiations of the organism's unity, never ideally self-transparent, never fully realized. Form as such is an abstraction from the form as it is concretely given, perceptually given. The organic form is neither a positive principle transcending its materialization, nor a self-enclosed system maintaining its identity through operational closure. It is a gestalt, but open, underdetermined one, and one that shows itself as such. Understanding what Merleau-Ponty means by this open gestalt requires, I think, briefly considering how his approach evolved from the structure of behavior. In his first book, The Structure of Behavior, after a lengthy analysis of naturalistic conceptions of bodily functioning and behavior, Merleau-Ponty concludes that, quote, what we have designated under the name of life was already the consciousness of life, end of quote. The holistic character of behavior and its underlying physiological processes, quote, can be only conceived in terms borrowed from the perceived world, such as form or melody. On the one hand, he insists that, quote, vital acts have a meaning, end of quote, and that the signification and value guiding a living organism's interaction with its environment are intrinsic to the true organism, which science also considers. However, on the other hand, in several key passages, he moves from this observation to the assertion that these acts are only understandable within the perceptual field of the observer. So, although these are two distinct insights, he does not thoroughly investigate their relationship. He kind of collapses them into one. In the concluding passages of the book, he defines his position as a transcendental attitude. So he believes to be representing philosophy which treats all conceivable reality as an object of consciousness. This implies that even the organism would be explained in this way, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The difficulty with this position is that while it establishes perception as a necessary condition for the appearance of organic wholes, it leaves the impression that the perception is also what accounts for their unity, as if the observer's perceptual field alone were sufficient. Since the organic whole is self-maintaining, however, this cannot be the case. There must be something in the perceived whole itself that makes us perceive it as an organic whole. As Merleau-Ponty himself explains later in the Nature lectures, the human subject, quote, has to intervene in order to bring meaning of natural phenomena out fully, but this isn't this disengagement of meaning is not constituting those phenomena themselves. The nature lectures take a decisive step forward. On the one hand, as we have seen, Merleau-Ponty now clearly acknowledges the self-organizing, self-producing dimension of the organism, what could be called a truth of naturalism that goes beyond the structural behavior. On the other hand, however, the developmental studies of HPhil, Gestalt, and Driesch have shown him that this self-organization is inherently incomplete. So the whole is never fully realized, never organically closed, always emergent. So the organism is a holistic gestalt, but one that is tightly linked to the concrete empirical history of its development. One key consequence is that the organism's holistic sense, its signification for the observer, is significantly more ambiguous than the comparatively more static holism of the structure of behavior would suggest. So it is precisely because the organic whole is never a fully realized entity, because it exists as an operative non-being, efficacious yet never positively given, that Merleau-Ponty characterizes it in the nature lectures as a phenomenon envelope or macro phenomenon. The organism's unity is not located in its microscopic constituents, but envelopes them as a macroscopic reality that appears between the microscopic facts. From an objective standpoint, this unity is, in a sense, virtual. It is constituted not only by what is factually there, but also by what lies between, by the fields and gradients that link local events into a pattern no analysis of those events in isolation can recover. This non-positive, envelope-like character of the whole is what grounds Merleau-Ponty's claim that life, quote, is not in itself, but is correlative with a vision, solidaire d'une vision, or of a gaze, as a correlative to a gaze, or some kind of outlook. The organic totality is never simply constituted by a perceptual consciousness, but it does require a perceiver situated at the appropriate scale to gather what is factually underdetermined into a unitary field. This is why Merleau-Ponty argues that understanding living beings cannot be accomplished by, as you could say, dissecting them into those microscopic constituents, but only by living alongside them. So he uses the French phrase coexister avec l'animalité. We have to coexist with the whole that we perceive, rather than analyze it into its constituent parts. And he comments on this in the following way: biologists who attempt to account for vital development mechanistically never grasp organic becoming in its original mode of appearance. They always come too early or too late. They never witness the development itself. In this sense, he claims that all zoology assumes from our side a methodological Einfühlung or empathy into animal behavior, with the participation of the animal in our perceptive life and the participation of our perceptive life in animality. So that's a quote from the summary of the second year of lectures on nature. So here I come to the second part of my talk, where I will discuss Gestalt psychological insights and Michotte's experiments, through which Merleau-Ponty clarifies how this Einfühlung or empathy is concretely realized. As it is clear from the preceding exposition, Merleau-Ponty's account of the genesis of organic wholes in his lectures on nature proceeds what appears to be an ontologically realistic perspective, that is, without regard to the role of the observer. However, when he concludes his discussion of embryological studies in the second year of the lectures, he takes a surprising and revealing turn. After summarizing his interpretation of HPhil and Gestalt's findings, he turns to three examples of perceived wholes: circle, movement, and painting. This is surprising because these phenomena initially seem entirely unrelated to the problem of organic wholes. Before examining these examples, it is worth noting that Merleau-Ponty's move here echoes, in a certain sense, his interpretative strategy from the structure of behavior, as I have outlined. There, too, he devotes a lengthy analysis to ontologically realistic conceptions of bodily functioning and behavior, both mechanistic and Gestalt theoretical, only to conclude that nature, life, and organisms are described within these frameworks, which are described in these frameworks, must ultimately be understood as phenomena given to perceptual consciousness. As we have seen, however, this conclusion also marks a limitation. At that stage, Merleau-Ponty had not yet recognized that an organic whole is self-constituting whole. Put differently, he had not yet explicitly recognized that the reference to perception is a necessary but not sufficient condition for understanding such a whole. So in the nature lectures, a similar puzzle arises. When Merleau-Ponty introduces his example of perceived wholes, he does not explain how a discussion of perceptual holism should illuminate the existence of real wholes, that is, organisms. After all, insofar as a whole is perceived, its unity in space and time is sustained by the perceiver. But this cannot be the full account of organic wholes, since Merleau-Ponty himself now recognizes that they are self-regulating and self-unifying. Merleau-Ponty's examples, however, bear an important relation to the considerations developed in other texts. The example of the becoming of a painting, as he phrases it, develops themes from elsewhere in the nature lectures. The example of the circle and movement draw on his earlier interpretations of Gestalt psychology at the Sorbonne and at the Collège de France from the first year, 1953. Although Merleau-Ponty does not make the connection explicit, tracing these examples to their sources in the other texts shows how they relate to the problem of the organic whole. The argument on movement is particularly important in my context, as it leads directly to the question of how we perceive the dynamic unity of living organic wholes. So I will now briefly comment on each of these examples before turning to a fourth case drawn from Albert Michotte's experiment, which is, for my purposes, the most consequential. So first, Merleau-Ponty's example of painting in the process of its emergence. He refers to filmed documentation of Picasso's and Matisse's painting processes. When we cannot see the artist's hand, the creation of the painting strikes us as miraculous. It combines logic and unpredictability. The colored patches initially appear disparate, yet a coherent order gradually emerges. For Merleau-Ponty, this mirrors what embryological studies reveal. The various outlines of organic structures arrive from different regions and at first form independent patterns or structures, but at a certain moment they interweave into a unified whole. The first indication of a bodily structure opens a horizon of possibilities that were not contained in it and that were in relation to it unforeseeable. The living body is thus something like a tapestry. Viewed up close from its reverse side, it appears as a chaotic tangle of threads. From the right distance, from its front or obverse side, it produces a meaningful whole. And the parallel with painting can be taken further. In his later discussion of Adolf Portman's idea of animal form, Tiergestalt, Merleau-Ponty argues that while an animal's interior generally gives the impression of a machine, so independent parts, its exterior, quote, gives the impression of a work of art, end of quote. This is sort of a reference to Portman. It is a unity in which all mechanistically describable parts are integrated into an expressive whole, meaningful for the observer. Much as the painter's disparate patches of color compose a coherent form only when seen from the right distance. The circle provides a related but slightly different argument. That's the second example Merleau-Ponty uses. A circle can be described analytically as the set of all points equidistant from a center. yet it possesses an intuitive sense that no such formula captures or replaces. Much as an organism can be described as a sum of physical parts, a perceived cycle can be decomposed into what seem to be its objectively existing constituents. But the global sense of the figure is not composed of these elements. It transcends them and, in a way, grounds the very possibility for them to have the sense they have. Merleau-Ponty further observes that even the distinction between the inner and the outer region of a cycle presupposes a bodily perceiver situated in space, since only such a perceiver can meaningfully relate to that distinction between outside and inside of the circle, and thus to have the intuitive meaning of the shape delineated by the contour. Finally, the third and the most important example Merleau-Ponty mentions is movement. From the standpoint of physics, movement is defined strictly by its antecedents. To perceive movement is, in a certain sense, to grasp the, From the standpoint of physics, the movement is defined strictly by its antecedents. So the perceived movement, by contrast, always tends somewhere. It has a direction and an aim. Perceived movement is, in a certain sense, to grasp the coming into being of what will follow and what has already begun. The apprehended totality of movement is not outside time of space. Rather, Merleau-Ponty describes it as an enjambement, an overstepping of the present toward what is to come. Movement, he insists, is something entirely different from a mere change of position in space. In his earlier works, Merleau-Ponty draws on Gestalt theory to overturn the traditional conception of movement as founded on the observation of a persisting object that merely assumes different positions in space. Movement, he argues, is a structural phenomenon. Its appearance depends on the overall organization of the phenomenal field, not on the enduring identity of the moving object. The existence of stroboscopic movement, extensively studied by Gestalt psychologists, confirms this point. The impression of motion arises from the configuration of the field, not from any actual displacement of an object. Following the Gestalt psychologist, Merleau-Ponty thus reverses the traditional relationship between the moving thing and its movement. It is not the object that determines how it will move. Rather, the being of the object, what the object is defined by the style of its phenomenal movement. The identification of the object is the result of the experience of movement, not its precondition. Since movement is, in this sense, disclosive of being, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, variations in movement, changes in speed, rhythm, and internal articulation do not merely modify a neutral displacement, but reveal the very kind of being at stake. As Merleau-Ponty himself observes, depending on the speed of projection, one and the same sequence of images may strike us as a scene from the mineral world, the world of plant life, or the animal world. What these three examples make visible then is that the unity of perceived wholes, whether a painting, a geometric figure, or a movement, is not a separable principle imposed on independently existing parts. It is inseparable from the concrete spatial-temporal realization of the phenomenon. The example of movement, in particular, reveals that our grasping of what a thing is depends on the phenomenal dynamics in which it participates. But this side doesn't yet tell us what is specifically organic about organic wholes. What happens when the perceived whole appears not merely as unified, but as the source of its own movement, as in the case of organic wholes? This is precisely the question that Merleau-Ponty addresses through his reading of Michotte. So this is where the pardon of Michotte comes in. In the nature lectures, Merleau-Ponty supplements these three examples with a fourth that is already directly connected to the problem of the organic whole: the perception of causal action whose source is a living being. It is only in this case that he explicitly invokes a specific figure from the Gestalt tradition, Albert Michotte. Merleau-Ponty's engagement with Michotte's book, The Perception of Causality, is brief in the Nature Lectures, but it draws on a thorough investigation accomplished earlier in the 1948 radio lectures, The World of Perception, in the 1949 Sorbonne lectures, and most extensively in the 1953 Collège de France lectures. That his engagement remained important to him is evident also from the last working notes from 1960, where he repeatedly returns to Michotte as well. For Merleau-Ponty, Michotte's central insight is that we originally perceive the world as a total organization in which effects are bound to causes before we subject them to intellectual analysis. Both Hume and Malebranche, he argues, interpret causality too intellectualistically. They decompose this total organization into supposedly independent elements and consequently conclude that the causal bond is merely subjective. Michotte's experiments demonstrate the contrary. We perceive causality or fail to perceive it, depending on precisely definable conditions that are always perceptual, not intellectual in character. So now let me briefly describe the experimental setup through which Michotte demonstrates these points. The principal phenomenon Michotte investigates is so-called launching effect. Effet lancement. Using a special projection apparatus, he displays a square A approaching a square B from the left. A stops at the moment of contact, whereupon B begins to move to the right while A remains stationary. I'll play it again. The observer has the irresistible impression that A transferred its movement to B, that the two movements are part of one global force, a single event in which A's movement metamorphoses in the movement of B. Okay, so one more time. This impression, however, arises only when precisely definable topographic, spatial, and temporal conditions are met. When these conditions change, the observer perceives a qualitatively different event. For instance, if the temporal interval between A's stopping and B's starting exceeds a certain threshold, the two movements appear as independent events. Or if B moves faster than A was moving, the effect appears not as launching, but as triggering. Effet déclenchement. I think I have it here. Oh no, that's a different one. This one should be triggering. Eventually, if the A continues to move together with B, the impression arises that A carries along B. Effet entraînement. So that's this one. From an objective standpoint, the difference between these variants is merely quantitative. From a phenomenal standpoint, however, they are qualitatively entirely different structures. The entraining variant is particularly instructive. Both A and B change their positions in space, yet A appears as actively displays B, while B is merely carried along. The sense of the change, which object is the agent, which passive, depends entirely on this spatial-temporal context. As Michotte reports, even adult observers spontaneously use animistic expressions to describe these events, for instance, that A kicks B. What the experiments reveal is that phenomenal causality is a function of the overall structure of the field, not an inference drawn from the observation of independently existing objects. These insights lead Merleau-Ponty to what is for our purposes the crucial case. In the conclusion of his book, Michotte discusses a special form of the above described causal relation, animal locomotion or self-movement or auto-locomotion. Here, certain configurations of the phenomenal field produce not merely the impression of an object moving spontaneously, what Michotte calls propulsion, but the impression of an object moving by its own forces, with the movement originating from within it. Michotte describes two principal kinds of such animal movement, crawling and swimming. To produce the impression of crawling, he animates a rectangle whose right edge moves to the right, then stops. The left end then moves to the right so that the figure returns to its original length. On the basis of this structuration alone, the rectangle differentiates into a head, the right edge, and a tail, left edge, and appears as a sort of caterpillar. In one variant of the movement is initiated by the tail, while the head immediately follows or catches up. In another, it's the reverse. So these are experiments of 65 and 66. This is the one of them. A different arrangement produces the impression of swimming, something like a frog-like movement. These are experiments 67, 68. This is 67. Here we have the impression of an organism moving through a liquid medium by means of kicks of its tail. The active function belongs to the tail, while the head appears inert. For these impressions to arise, two structural conditions prove decisive. First, speed. The sense of organic movement depends on a specific pace. Variations that are too slow or too fast destroy the impression of crawling or swimming entirely. These are experiments 69 and 60, the A and B. I can show them in a moment. And second, and more importantly, the figure must be closed. The impression of self-movement disappears if we separate the movement of the head from the movement of the tail, for instance, by removing the horizontal lines of the rectangle. This would be this one, experiment 70. These lines, the horizontal lines, play no role in the movement itself, but their presence is necessary for us to see a closed figure within the movement, within which the movement responsible for the overall displacement appears to be generated. When these conditions obtain, the overall movement appears as the consequence of an internal change in the figure, what Michotte calls internal flux. In Merleau-Ponty's words, quote, the movement of autolocomotion always seems to be produced by an internal change which seems motivated by a sort of internal circulation of matter by all those who observe. The rectangle appears filled with a type of vague protoplasm. What is remarkable here is that we are watching nothing more than a projected series of abstract lines or shapes, figures that look nothing like any actual living being. And yet the observer perceives crawling or swimming irresistibly, I hope so at least, without being consciously aware of any specific organism. Life, it seems, reveals itself here in its pure phenomenal form. Merleau-Ponty highlights that the experience of organic living form is not based on mentally positing the idea of an animal, but is evolved by phenomena possessing specific structural traits, topographic, spatial, and temporal. Michotte's experiments, he notes, demonstrate our deep-seated inclination to experience perceptual figures as endowed with an ipseity, or identity, with a body, and a relational system geared to their surroundings. What these experiments bring to light is our general perceptual capacity to encounter life, which is, for Merleau-Ponty, rooted in the body rather than in the mind. Perceptual values arise from the interaction between one's body schematic system and the environmental elements that solicit bodily engagement. One perceives movement, its sense, and its characteristic pace, as Merleau-Ponty writes, through motor possibilities of one's own body. The perceived organic movement plays sort of on a keyboard that the empathizing observer brings to the encounter. Their own body schema as a system of relationship with their surroundings and their own capacity for agency. Drawing on Husserl's analysis of intersubjective experience, Merleau-Ponty characterizes this relation as one of intercorporeal identification rather than mental projection. And I quote again Merleau-Ponty. Michotte's experiments show that the apparition of a closed figure gives rise to the identification of my body with it and Einfühlung of its relationship with the outside. The observer does not conclude that the figure is alive. Rather, the phenomenal structure solicits a bodily resonance. Its organization comes to interrogate the system of my relationships with my surroundings. Between one's perception and the perceived figure, moreover, there is what Merleau-Ponty calls intentional encroachment. One cannot relate to such figure as a surveying spectator. The resonance is not a unilateral projection from observer onto object, but a reciprocal implication. In the final passages of his comment on Michotte, Merleau-Ponty connects the experiments directly with the embryological cases discussed in the first section. And I quote Merleau-Ponty, in the global vision of the becoming of the embryo, there is the experience of the imminence of the future, the apparition of a center, as in Michotte's experiment, to which this or that could happen, seen as an ipseity. All of this is visible only globally. End of quote. The corporeal resonance at work in Michotte's experiments is thus the same resonance at work whenever we encounter an organic whole, including the embryos described by HPhil and Gestalt. Finally, Merleau-Ponty's working notes from the last years suggest that the reciprocal perceptual implication discovered in Michotte's experiment is not an artifact of the human perspective, but something realized in the structure of living bodies themselves. A living being's outward appearance itself contains, as Portman showed, a reference to a possible I. The animal body is an organ for the, it's an organ for the other. That's quote from Merleau-Ponty. So the body is constructed not only to function, but to be seen or perceived. There are, Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, specular or mirror-like relationships between animals, each being the mirror of the other. And this is not a secondary reality, a human perspective superimposed on an order of in itself, but a field of inter-animal encroachment. It's a combination of quotes from Merleau-Ponty's last working notes. And organisms' perceptual capacities are basically inscribed into the visible form of the other organisms and vice versa. Merleau-Ponty calls this field interanimality, the ontological counterpart of corporeal empathy described above. We empathize with Michotte's figures and with living beings, not because we project our own experience onto them, but because living bodies are structured to solicit and sustain one another's perception. The perception of organic wholes is not an epistemic act performed by a subject upon an object, but a reciprocal implication rooted in how living bodies are constructed and how they interact. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now we have some time for questions. Yeah, Philippe.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. So I have two questions. The first one is about the very last part of your talk, the intentional encroachment.